time, Eric Martin was working at a paper mill in Maine, and he had been working at this paper mill for 20 years, and he was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his back out. And in fact, he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled. And so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelly Martin, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelly, who had not worked in a long time, was able, through some connections, to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live relative to where they had been living, that for less money, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreage, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on the property, you'd look out, and it was just a full 360 degrees of very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails. It was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked. So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they're unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifle into the house, Shelly says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn. You're going to put your guns in there." This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelly just didn't feel safe having guns in the house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately Eric agrees, okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house. I'll put them in the barn. And so he went in the barn, and he and his son, Sean, who he had come out to help him, they built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in the barn, and then they locked that and then locked the barn itself. So they were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over that first year, Shelly and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day, they would go out on the front porch of their farmhouse and look out onto the front yard, and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelly and Eric are sitting on their front porch, enjoying their coffee, they're chatting, and Shelly thinks she sees something in the woods. Now, you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they were seeing. Right in front of their porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars. About 20 meters away from their house to the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out from the porch, is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area. And then way beyond the field was the beginning of this tree line, of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights. And she described it as like a pulsating light. It did not look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road out straight ahead from their porch. It was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property, someone illegally hunting on his property. And so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying the night that night, he gets him to come outside and say, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there at the edge of our tree line?" And Sean's like, "I don't know, maybe." Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property, and so he asks Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property, you need to leave." As they're walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the lights, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. Even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods. Even though it's totally dark, we're not going to get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, "This is private property," so they really do leave. And so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest, lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk, 10, 15 meters into the woods, and then they hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator. And so they thought, you know what? The lights are gone. I don't know what animal this is. Let's just get out of here. About a month goes by, and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm. And it was the first nice spring day. I mean, it was a very dark and dreary winter. Maine winters tend to be that way. And so that weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decide, let's go walk around the woods. So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and then heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. And so at first, Chelsea has the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off their leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the wintertime as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters, and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound. And there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they're poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make this, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into this den, but it's totally dark, and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the den. And so without any hesitation, he goes, we gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go. And so they take the dogs, they put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelly, and actually Sean was there too, and they said, hey, we found this den of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean said, well, about a month ago, we were out in that same area, and we could have sworn we heard some animal stalking us. A couple of months go by, and Eric and Shelly are sitting on their front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field. And as they're sitting there, they're commenting on how creepy it was. And what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelly had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property, not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything, and so she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking to Eric about whatever they normally talked about over coffee at night. Eric would say in numerous interviews that for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, he suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We'll go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And then all of a sudden, Shelly stops. And she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line. And she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops. Because right in the middle of the field are three creatures that look like wolves. These huge creatures that are looking right at them. Two others join them. So there's 5 wolf-like creatures that are staring at them right from the middle of their field. She says to Eric, what are those? And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We gotta go inside. And so Shelly's just holding the light and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door and they lock it. And without saying a word, the two of them make their rounds across the entire bottom floor, lock every window, close every blind, make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these 5 creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house had been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of their cabin, and Eric's saying, my guns are in the barn. We have no protection. And Shelly is like, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, we don't know. Don't go out there. Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts off all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut, And then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, hey, come here, you got to look at this. And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. But they're kind of poking their head out the window and she's like, look. And standing on the gravel are these 5 creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelley in the window. And the creature stands on its 2 legs. It gets on its hind legs and looks at her. And Shelley gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelley's on the ground looking at Chelsea. And she can't believe what she just saw. It's like her brain can't process that this creature, one, had even seen her. They barely had their head up in the window. But that it stood on its hind legs, that it was so big. What are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house waiting for us? What's going on here? And so Shelley tells Chelsea, get in your bed, don't go to your windows, don't leave this room. And that's when Shelley also remembers that she hasn't heard her 2 dogs and she's worried they might be outside. And so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dogs. She's calling to her 2 dogs and they don't come out, goes into the master bedroom and finds her 2 dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other. Like they're startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect the family. But he knew that between his own disability, he can barely walk very fast and he'd have to unlock the barn and then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that. All the while he's exposed to these animals that are out there. And so the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck and back the truck up to the front door. And then he could get his wife and his daughter to come out, jump in the car and they could drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on the gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house. And so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's too dangerous to go out there. He starts pacing some more and he goes back to look and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them, all 5. He can see all 5. They're facing the house still. But he can see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field and he can see all 5. And he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get the car, back it up without them seeing me. And so without telling Shelley, he opens the door and he goes onto the front porch and he sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight on them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away. And as he's getting closer and closer to his truck, he's got his eye on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. They apparently haven't seen him. He gets to the driver's side of his truck and he's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button. And then his motion sensor light kicks on. And he's so on edge being out there. When the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled. And the first thing he does, he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, he grabs his keys, he runs back to the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and slams it right as he can hear them crossing the gravel right in front of the house. And he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look in the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelley, who was upstairs, can hear everything going on and she yells, Eric, what's going on? And he goes, stay up there, stay up there. Shelley, Eric, Chelsea, everyone's just frozen waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along his wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelley and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared. So they decide they gotta call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up, and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelley lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside their property. And immediately the police officer who's responding to this, he's like, all right, well, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear? And finally, she's like, no, can you please just come over here? And he's like, listen, ma'am, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And ultimately, that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless, and Eric especially felt really frustrated because he can't protect his family. He doesn't have a weapon. He can't get to his vehicle. They're just trapped. And so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. And so for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blocked everything as best as they could. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. As they go upstairs, they lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs. And they get on the bed and they just decide all we can do is wait until the sun comes up. During the time they were barricading their house, they would look out from time to time and they would see the 5 creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them. When they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off of the gravel. And they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch. And it's totally silent besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening where they were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on the family. Now, the way the house was set up is there was a second floor roof, and then the first floor was a little bit wider than the second floor and had its own kind of separate roof. And after a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it's just silence. And then they would hear them jump onto that first roof. The scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the second floor windows. And so they're laying there and periodically they'd be looking out their window. There was windows on either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time, these creatures would walk past their windows and they would stop, they'd put their paws up onto the window and they would look inside. But there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass. So they couldn't see the creature and the creature couldn't see them. All night, they're listening to these creatures running around. And sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching, like they'd figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke the glass. They never got inside the house. As the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they could hear them running away. And for about an hour, they didn't hear anything outside. The sun's come up and they felt safe again. And so they left their room, they go downstairs and they finally open it up, and all over their property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier is they found all these points on the house, in particular on the second floor when they were walking on that roof, where there was clear markings that they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. I mean, it was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house, but they had just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly after that. And they have not experienced anything like that since they left. So what do you think those creatures were? Was that a bear, a wolf, or something else? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I will get back to all the early commenters. So get in there and give me your best theory. In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security at a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capital City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of the security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night, especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, now we're going to go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. before you come back to the control room. You'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. Everything in the building was pretty old, and Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night. They're going to be working together a lot. And Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off, finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom, and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon, and he's looking down the hall. He doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes two things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol. He's got it on the door as well. And they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom and no one's in there. And there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom, and that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors. Everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor? And Morgan's like, no. And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights, they shut all the doors, everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been, locked, lights off, nothing down there. And they go down to the basement, and even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet, and there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the third floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that door slammed, but the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, we were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here. And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the second floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater. Just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in and there's no fire, but all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking and there's nothing. And then at some point, the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater? Because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was and they sit down and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 9-10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work and I heard the elevator kick on. Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator. And he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's in the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows. But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's looking out the window and he hears this alarm, this like ringing sound going off, but the door isn't shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door. Why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, there's no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door closed, door closed, door closed. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out if they're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut. One by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? Maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea. And so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, but he was interested. And since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him. And so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater and Greg shows up. And so they start this tour. They go in the main auditorium. They're looking around and they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light and Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? But before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we got to go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture, and he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely, and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And it starts turning its head like this. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder. The piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light. No one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He's done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, "You can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit." And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full-time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. And when at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, "Hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it. And even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, "What's going on? Is someone still in there?" He said that he had been doing security rounds and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was whirring up to the third floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there. And then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, "Look, let's just go search the building. We'll do it together." They clear the whole theater. No one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped, Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, "What?" And Josh goes, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, "Great, I'm glad I work here now." This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s, there was this horrible fire, and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted, and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. On January 23rd, 2005, which is actually a day that is remembered by the people of New York as Black Sunday, Curtis Myron, who was a New York City firefighter, was trapped on the 4th floor of an apartment in the Bronx. Blazing inferno. He, along with 5 other firefighters, are trapped on the top floor. There was no way out, and they elected to jump from the 4th floor. And unfortunately, Curtis, along with another firefighter, did not survive the fall. In addition to those 2 lives that were lost, another fire had broken out separately in New York the same day that claimed the life of a 3rd firefighter. This was the largest loss of life for the New York City Fire Department since the September 11th attacks. Curtis's wife, Jeanette, and their 2 daughters, Angela, who was a young teenager, and Deneen, who was a little bit younger than Angela, they were inconsolable. They never thought that their father, their husband, would not come home again. But they were faced with this horrible new reality where Dad wasn't coming home. The Black Sunday tragedy, the loss of those 3 firefighters, had become very high profile. And so news channels and media outlets were showing up at Jeanette's property, hoping to get an interview with she or her kids about what had happened. And they were just not interested in that. And so they felt very trapped inside of the house. And the house itself had been built by Curtis. He had literally built the house. And so it was just a constant reminder of the sadness of this loss. And at some point, Jeanette just said to the girls, "I think we should move. I think we just need a fresh start. This is too much. It's too much to be here. Let's just move." And the girls were very eager to leave. So Jeanette starts doing some house hunting, and quickly she finds this nice little house on Long Island where they live, but farther away from the city. And it was sitting on an acre of land, which for the price that was being asked for it, it was unheard of. They went to the property and Jeanette could see that the house needed a ton of work. But all of Kurt's firefighter buddies were very eager to support Jeanette and her kids, and they offered to come by and actually help them do the renovations on the house. And so Jeanette bought the house, and very quickly she and her 2 daughters moved in, and all of Kurt's firefighter buddies showed up and began this massive house renovation. I mean, they were basically tearing it down to the studs and rebuilding the whole house. Because of this massive renovation project, a lot of the doors and windows were not secured. And so at night, Jeanette felt really uncomfortable. So she went out and purchased 7 cameras to fit on the outside of the house to monitor the property. And all of the cameras streamed to her laptop where she could watch them at any time. And so she found herself watching these cameras a lot on her laptop, just kind of reflexively watching what was happening around her property. And so one night, Jeanette's at her house, her kids are upstairs, and she's got her laptop open and she's watching these feeds from the 7 different cameras. And she admitted that it was just kind of fun to watch the cameras. It felt, kind of cool to see what was going on outside, but from the safety of your home. And she was watching one particular feed that was showing the edge of her property where there was this big forest that basically butted up against their property, where there was a swing set in their driveway. And she was looking out at this big open front yard of theirs. And from the tree line, she watched a figure emerge it looked like a man in a cloak, walk up to their driveway and walk a little ways down the driveway before stopping and staring up at the house. Jeanette was so caught off guard by what she was seeing that she didn't do anything. She just stood there watching this figure. And as soon as the figure had gotten there and was watching the house, it turned back around and walked back into the woods and vanished. It was late. Jeanette didn't know what she'd even seen. The cameras were not super HD, so she thought it must have been an animal or it was just an anomaly of the camera itself. So at the same time that Jeanette is looking at her laptop and she's trying to make sense of this figure she's seen, upstairs, the two girls are in their own bedrooms, which are on other ends of the hallway. Angela was laying on her bed with her back up against the wall and she's reading a book, and she starts hearing tapping along the same wall that her back is against, and she can almost feel it in her back. She puts her book down and sits forward and turns and is listening really intently to where the tapping had been coming from. And then she hears bang, 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 like someone's trying to get her attention. She gets right out of her bed and goes to her door. She opens it up and looks downstairs, because from where her door opened, she could look into the living room on the first floor. And immediately she saw her mom on her laptop. Her mom was not banging on anything. And her sister was in her room and she was down the hall. And so that couldn't have been her sister. So she goes back in her room and she's thinking to herself, I'm hearing things. She puts her ear right up against the wall, and as soon as her ear makes contact with the wall, she said it sounded like someone smashed the wall right on the other side of her ear. It causes her to freak out, and she goes right into her bed and throws the covers over her head and she hides. What Angela didn't know is that down the hall, her younger sister, Deneen, had heard tapping as well, but her tapping sounds were not coming from the wall, they were coming from the door. And she thought her mom had come upstairs to see what she was doing, so she got up, walked to the door, opened it up, and there was nothing. She did the same thing that Angela did and poked her head down and saw her mom sitting on the couch. She looked down the hall and she saw that Angela's door was closed. It wasn't Angela. So she shuts the door, and as soon as it shuts, she hears 3 distinct taps on the door. She opens it up again. There's no one there. She, too, runs into her bed and jumps under the covers. The girls would say in interviews that the tapping sounds continued periodically throughout most of the night, but at some point they both managed to fall asleep under the covers. The next morning, the girls go downstairs and they're in the kitchen and they tell each other what they had heard the night before. And they both start feeding off of each other because they both had this experience and didn't realize it. Angela would say to Deneen, yeah, I heard these tapping sounds. Deneen is picking up on her fear and she's saying, I heard tapping sounds. And the kids are really wound up. And that's when Jeanette comes into the kitchen and she sees her kids talking about something that seems really intense. And she goes, what's going on? What are you talking about? And they said, Mom, we think something's wrong with the house. We heard tapping sounds last night. This happened to me. This happened to me. And Jeanette just says, guys, it's a brand new house. We aren't used to the sounds the house makes. I'm sure it's just pipes or, creaking floorboards or something. You guys are overthinking it. Don't worry about a thing. The house is fine. Over the following few days, some of the firemen that were helping renovate the house began to work on the basement. The basement was full of clutter. It was like whoever had lived there before had never taken anything out. Very old pieces of machinery and furniture and strange boxes and papers. And the first step to fixing the basement was just going to be emptying it. And so the firemen were removing things from the basement when one of them, his name was Tom, he was one of Kurt's very good friends, Tom discovered that on the ground, underneath all the clutter, was this large pentagram, which is a 5-pointed star inside of a circle that is almost always associated with satanic worship. Tom gets Jeanette to come downstairs and he shows her what's in the ground and he says, what do you want me to do about this? And Jeanette said, paint over it. I don't want my kids to see this. But what Jeanette didn't know is that the kids had actually been playing outside over the past couple of days out in that forest in their property. And they had found a number of pentagrams carved into trees, into rocks, carved into the dirt on the ground. They were everywhere. They decided not to tell their mom because they didn't want their mom to worry. So they're both siloing information about these pentagrams all over their property. A couple of days later, Angela was going to be home alone for a few hours. And Jeanette had given Angela some chores, which included cleaning out the refrigerator. And so Angela's in the kitchen and she's got the fridge open and she's taking things out and cleaning off each of the different drawers. And she can't help but feel like someone is standing behind her. She kept turning around and no one was standing in the kitchen, but she just could not shake this feeling that someone was behind her. And so she's looking at the fridge at one point and she's about to just give up on cleaning the fridge and explain to her mom that she would just do it later, when all of a sudden she hears behind her this loud explosion. She hears pots and pans and knives and forks clattering all over the ground. And she instantly turns around and every cabinet, every drawer has come flying open and all of their contents have come smashing onto the floor. She sprints up to her bedroom screaming and hides in the corner. Shortly thereafter, Jeanette comes home. She goes goes inside and she sees the kitchen is an absolute mess. It looks like someone had broken in, and she starts screaming for Angela, thinking the worst. Someone's broken in. What happened to my daughter? She's running upstairs screaming for Angela. She finds Angela curled up in the corner of her bedroom. What's going on? What happened to the kitchen? And Angela just could not put an answer together. She was so shocked by what happened. So Jeanette tells her to stay here. She runs around the house, making sure that no one's there. She gets her laptop, goes back to Angela, opens it up, and she checks the footage. No one's in their house. No one's been near their house. All the while, Angela's just sobbing hysterically. And finally, after Jeanette is convinced that there has not been a home invasion, she turns to Angela and she's like, what is going on? Why does the kitchen look like this? And Angela tried to explain what happened, but it just didn't make any sense. And so Jeanette was getting frustrated with Angela and saying, did you do that down in the kitchen? But when Angela didn't change her story and just looked terrified, Jeanette started to see that Angela wasn't lying. This incident really rattled Angela, and Jeanette would comment in different interviews that it was at this point that Angela began to withdraw quite a bit. She was really upset about what had happened in the kitchen, but there wasn't really a good way to handle it, and so Jeanette didn't know what to say to her daughter. Angela didn't know how to talk about it, and so it was just this awful cloud in their life that they had this really intense thing happen, but there's just no explanation for it. A couple of days after the kitchen incident, and the crew that had been clearing out the basement got to the point where they were ready to actually start tearing down drywall. And so as they start demoing the walls, they find hidden in the walls a journal. And it's this very old looking journal with some lace wrapped around it. And one of the firemen gives it to Jeanette and just says, hey, I thought you might want to look at this. I don't know what to make of it, but it was in your wall. Jeanette opened it up and she began flipping through it, and she saw a date that was 1927, and she knew that was actually the date that this house was actually built. It seemed like this was a journal written by someone named Christina, who seemed fairly young. And as she's flipping through this journal, it really starts to take a dark turn when she sees diagrams of these ritualistic sacrifices of animals and of people that apparently were taking place in this house, because the diagram clearly indicated that it was happening in the basement. And even weirder is there was this room that they didn't know what it was for in the basement that was underneath the stairs, that it wasn't really a closet. It was all cement on all four sides. It was like someone had put a pocket of cement underneath the stairs, and they always wondered what it was. And some of the diagrams indicated that some of these sacrificing was going on underneath the stairs in that room. Jeanette decides to keep the journal from her kids. She does not want them to know that this was found in the walls. A couple of days later, Angela is in her bedroom listening to music on her headphones, and at some point she thinks she hears someone call her name. She takes her headphones out, she goes to the door, opens up, looks down and says, hey mom, did you call me? And her mom's like, no. She looks down the hall and she can hear that her sister is showering in the bathroom at the end of the hall, so it wasn't her. And so, Angela, she has a healthy fear of this house because of really the kitchen incident more than anything else. But she's thinking, okay, I must have heard something, not a big deal. So she goes back into her room and she sits down in her bed. But before putting her headphones back in, she hears someone say, get Deneen. And it's coming from in the walls. Immediately, she's terrified. Down the hall, she hears Deneen, who's in the shower, screaming bloody murder. Angela starts running to the bathroom to see what's going on with Deneen, right as Jeanette is flying up the stairs to go see what's going on with Deneen. They open up the door and Deneen is huddled on the ground screaming about some person in the bathroom with her. And she kept turning around and no one was there. Jeanette would say when she saw her daughter, she looked so scared she thought she was having a seizure. And Jeanette immediately grabs a towel, scoops up her daughter. She grabs Angela and they leave the bathroom. They go running into Jeanette's room and they get into Jeanette's bed and they're all huddled there. And Jeanette's trying to ask Deneen what she saw. And so Deneen finally says that she was in the shower and she heard someone saying her name and it sounded like a male voice. And she's just looking through the frosted glass and all of a sudden she sees a big hand land on the outside of the shower door. Jeanette felt so helpless. She had lost her husband. Her kids have lost their father, and there's all these strange things happening in the house, and Jeanette just felt like she couldn't protect them. It was around this time that Jeanette really felt like she should leave the house. But financially, they were really invested into this house, so it would have been very difficult to leave just financially. And then also the amount of time and energy all the firefighters, all of Kurt's friends had put into renovating the house and, gutting it and fixing it up. It was so much time and energy that she felt like she would be letting them down if she left. And she couldn't possibly tell them that the reason that she was leaving is because the house is haunted. And so she just felt trapped. A couple of days go by and everybody is just on edge in the house. Angela, Deneen, Jeanette, they don't like being there. And Angela just felt really cooped up when she was home, and she was just scared of being in the house. And so one night she decides to go outside and just swing on their swing, which was on their front property. Jeanette is inside the house doing dishes where there's a window that looks out the front of the house where you can see this swing set. When she finishes doing the dishes, she takes her eye off of Angela for a moment and she walks into the other room to sit down on the couch. She grabs her laptop, she opens it up and figures she can keep an eye on Angela using the security camera that was pointing in that direction. So she opens up the program and she pulls up all the camera feeds, and she's shocked when on the camera feed with Angela, she sees the same cloaked figure she had seen the first time she'd been looking at the live feeds, standing right behind Angela. And immediately she's up and sprinting outside, screaming for Angela. As soon as she gets outside, she hears Angela screaming for her mother before she's even seen her mother. And when she turns the corner, she sees Angela screaming in pain on the ground in front of the swing, and there's no cloaked figure anywhere. She runs over and she can see that Angela's ankle has been badly broken or dislocated. And so she scoops her up and she said, "What happened?" And Angela said that somebody pushed me. Someone pushed me off the swing. They go to the hospital and sure enough, she had dislocated and broken her ankle. When they got home that night, Jeanette opened up the laptop and reviewed the footage from outside. And she saw this figure walk out of the woods, and the swing was right up against the woods, and it goes right behind Angela and appears to push Angela and then goes back into the woods. Jeanette called the police. She showed them the footage, and they feel really bad, and they can clearly see what happened. But there's no way to identify the figure that came out of the tree line. They just told them to be careful, don't go in your woods, and if you see this figure again in any of your camera feeds, call us right away and we'll come right over and we'll do what we can. So at this point, Jeanette is terrified. She can't protect her kids, and she doesn't leave them really at any point. She's 24/7 in the same room with her kids. They're sleeping in the same room, and the only time she would leave them is during the day for very brief stints. And on one day, a couple of days after the swing incident, Jeanette needed to go to the pharmacy, and so Angela's going to be alone for about an hour and a half. And so her mom leaves, and Angela is in her bedroom, and she's sitting on her bed, and she's listening to music. At some point, she thinks she hears banging coming from somewhere in her room. Now, at this point, Angela's been pretty shaken up after living here. She had the incident in the kitchen where everything flew out of the drawers and cupboards. She's been hearing tapping and banging sounds. She has her sister's story about the hand on the glass in the shower. She just got pushed off a swing by some cloaked figure. I mean, she's scared of this place. And so every sound is going to terrify her. And when she started hearing that tapping sound, she took out her headphones. She looks over at her closet and she can see that the doors are rattling. She is so immediately scared that she gets off of the bed and goes underneath and tucks up against the side of the wall. She could actually see the bottom of the closet, and she can see it still rattling, and she's tucked up against the wall. And as she's looking, the doors slowly slide open, and she sees a figure walk out of her closet that must have been standing there the whole time that she had been laying on her bed. She said this horrible smell filled the room, and she said that it looked like it had human feet, bare feet, but it was a totally dark figure. It was hard to really pick out if it looked human or not, but it began walking around her room, and she believed it was looking for her. And she heard its footsteps as it walked all over her room. And at some point, it walks into the hall out of her bedroom. And she's just laying there under her bed, hoping that it doesn't come back. And then when she thinks it's walked all the way downstairs, it goes quiet. And then she hears it running up the stairs, running into her bedroom, runs right in front of the bed. Its feet are aimed right at her. It climbs onto her bed. She can hear the springs condensing right above her. And she's looking out wide-eyed, holding her mouth. And all of a sudden, its head appears looking down directly at her. And it's this dark face, sunken eyes. It looks like its skin is rotting off of its head. And it's just staring at her upside down, looking directly at her. At this point, she screams and the figure goes back up onto the bed, and now it's sitting right above her. She's screaming uncontrollably, and then she hears it get off the bed, but she doesn't know where it went in the room. And so for the next 45 minutes, she lays there expecting this thing to come back. It knows where she is. It knows she's under the bed. And she can hear it occasionally running around the house. She can just smell this horrible smell. And at some point, she hears her mom's car outside and she starts screaming for her mother. Her mother must have heard her because she comes bombing into the house. She runs up the stairs. She's screaming for Angela. Angela's screaming for her mom. And then she finally finds Angela under the bed. She pulls her out and she holds her and she's trying to figure out what's going on. And Angela's saying that he's in the house. He's in the house. He's in the house. I don't know what it is. He came out of my closet. Jeanette runs all through the house looking for anything or anyone in the house. There's nothing. It's gone. At this point, Jeanette is at her wit's end. She doesn't know what to do. So she takes Angela. She gets in the car. They drive to where Deneen is. Deneen was with a friend at the time. They get Deneen. So the three of them are together now, and they drive to Jeanette's parents' house. And while they're there, Jeanette calls a paranormal investigator and she says, I need your help. I need help to get rid of what's going on in my house. And so she gets in touch with this woman named Liz, who offers to do a cleansing of the house. And after the cleansing was done, Jeanette would say that it appeared that everything stopped in the house. And somewhat unbelievably, Jeanette and Angela and Deneen decided to stay in the house where this demon was. That they felt confident that the cleansing had gotten rid of it. And to this day, they still live there. If it was me, I would have been out of that house and never gone back. So I'd love to get your reaction to this story. Do you think there was some paranormal entity that was haunting them in the house? Or do you think this is just a product of extreme grief and anxiety as a result of the death of their husband and father? Or is it something else? Let me know what your theory is in the comments, and I will do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you enjoyed this video, then the next time the like button asks you to get them a regular iced coffee, go to Starbucks and get an iced coffee, but ask for light ice. And then hand that joke of a drink to the fool that is the like button. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads I do every week. If you have a story submission, we have a subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. You can post your story there, and if I intentionally use one of your suggestions, I will absolutely credit you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My username is JohnBallen416. I also have a Twitter account that I really just started using, and my handle is JohnBallen416 over there as well. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. So whether I see you on Instagram, Reddit,